Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle.
One of the key themes in world history is the continuity of human interactions with trade. I can imagine that when you hear this, you're probably rolling your eyes a little. Okay, why is this so important? Actually, it means pretty much everything. Trade is central to human economic, social, artistic, ideological, and therefore political actions. When human societies open themselves up to trade, they're not just exchanging goods and services. They're also diffusing or spreading ideas and cultural practices. This means that there are going to be a lot of changes and challenges to the values and identities of these societies. China is a really good and excellent place to start off in understanding this. Okay, so let's remember that modern world history, the course we're in, jumps us really far ahead in history. So we're actually starting in 1200 CE, or the Common Era. Well, before that time, there have been a lot of Chinese dynasties, including the Jia, the Shang, the Chu, the Qin, and the Han. However, when we look at all those dynasties that come before 1200 CE, there are three big patterns that you really need to remember from this period. 1. Ancestor worship. During the Shang dynasty, the Chinese formed a tradition of reverence for their ancestors. So even after death, the ancestors watch over their descendants from heaven and bless them. Number 2, the mandate of heaven. During the Chu dynasty, there was a tradition that was established, justifying an emperor's authority based upon his righteousness. A good emperor would remain in power. An evil one would be removed by the spirits in heaven. Then there's number 3, Chinese legalism versus Chinese Confucianism. Okay, so this is sort of like a 3 and a 4, but I'm going to combine them together because they fought amongst each other. Chinese legalists believed that humans were sort of selfish and nasty, and only an all-powerful emperor could control them. Confucius and Confucianism argued that humans were basically good, and that humans were best organized through family, or what was called filial relationships. And that one's really important. I want you to remember that for Southeast Asia, the notion of filial relationships or family. So between 580 to 1270 CE, the Common Era, the Chinese had 3 important new dynasties: the Sui, the Tang, and the Song. These dynasties expanded the Chinese influence into places like Vietnam, Korea, Tibet, and Manchuria. This expansion led to the exchange of new crops and goods. For example, the Chinese took the Vietnamese harvesting of what was called champa rice because the rice could grow in drier climates. Also, the Song dynasty developed more manufacturing capabilities of steel and iron production. And all of this dynamic economic activity led to more Chinese production and the exporting of goods like porcelain and textiles. China was an economically hopping country. Does this matter outside of the world of economics? Absolutely. First, whenever you see economic activity during any time period, you should immediately ask, how is this affecting the culture of the country? Remember, China was largely based upon the 3 principles: ancestor worship, mandate of heaven, Chinese legalism, and Confucianism. This meant that Chinese peasants were instructed to have strong deference or respect for the emperor, the local governors, and sort of the father figures who were in the household. And by father figure, I'm being both metaphorical and literal. This is a patriarchal society, one controlled by men. Also, Chinese Confucianism taught that the major goal in the Chinese society was practical stability that would benefit all people. However, increased trade meant that there was more contact with other groups of people. For several centuries, Buddhists who had come from India into China, they were sent by the Indian Mauryan emperor, a man named Ashoka, to spread the ideas of Buddha. Throughout this period, Buddhism's principle of detachment, or breaking away from the materialistic world, ran right up against the Confucian desire for practical progress. If you're detaching or taking yourself away from the practical world or the material world, how are you supposed to be practical to get things done? So you can imagine that the Chinese Confucian leaders were not so happy about cultural diffusion. Buddhists themselves were also changed by the increased level of trade and interactions. The founder of Buddhism, Sidartha Gautama, had taught that there was this need to detach or break away from an ever-changing physical world. So you can imagine this didn't go over so well with merchants who the Buddhists were appealing to along the Silk Roads, right? They needed to make profits from trade. They didn't want to detach from the real world. So Buddhists began to change their message. They created new groups or sects of Buddhism called Theravada, Mahayana, and Tibetan Buddhism. Now, there's a lot of things in each one of those sects that are different, but overall they stress that a person could reach nirvana by being prayerful, being pious, and being respectful, and by doing prayers in front of different types of statues and monuments. Now note, all these are accommodations to the physical world, authorities, and trade. In other words, China changed Buddhism. But don't think that China got away without some change on their end. Increased trade in China led to new transportation routes. There was a huge creation of what was called the Grand Canal, a waterway that stretched from the northern part to the southern part of China. Port cities along that canal developed, and this meant a new merchant class. And that class threatened the traditional farming base of Confucian China. At the same time, Chinese leaders started to teach a new form of Confucianism, or Neo-Confucianism. According to Neo-Confucianism, an individual could attain heaven, read nirvana here, if she was or he was pious, respectful of elders, and followed the sacred traditions of China. In other words, China's Confucianism adapted to Buddhism, and it provided merchants with a reward for showing reference. Okay, so what should you take away from all of this? There are three really big things I want you to think about. Number one, trade was a continuity, and it led to dynamic changes in the creation of new goods and services like champa rice, iron and steel, textiles, porcelain, and new trade routes. Number two, Chinese culture remained the same based upon the principles of deference to authority, filial piety, and patriarchy. Number three, culture was also diffused through trade, and it was syncretized, meaning it blended things together. Buddhism was changed by trade into a more worldly and practical religion. Chinese Confucianism adopted a more spiritual beliefs in order to manage new classes and new values. So I hope this gives you a good introduction into East Asia and Southeast Asia for the interactions of trade and cultural identity. Okay, see you in class.